My name is Jeremy Rich. I'm going to be talking a little bit about taking your PC game and transitioning it successfully from PC to mobile, talking a little bit about a handful of different techniques. I belong to a company called DropForge Games. We're a relatively new startup based out in Bellevue, Washington. We have 13 employees, and we're currently hiring, so if you're at all interested, come talk to me after about that as well. A few things I'm going to be talking about today are guiding players through the transition in terms of building out single-player experiences, talking a little bit about touch controls, session lengths. Obviously, as most of you know, the session lengths dramatically vary between PC and mobile, the first-time user experience, and then trying to retain players long-term. I wanted to highlight a handful of games as well. There have, over the past half dozen years, been a ton of games that have come from PC to mobile, games like Doom, games like Jet Set Radio, games like Tetris. One of my favorites is Hearthstone. I think they've done a fantastic job. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But you find that a lot of games take different approaches in terms of how they port their game from PC to mobile. Some try to port it pretty much directly, and some try to do a better job of creating different experiences. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the reason I'm here talking right now is we're doing the very same thing right now. We took a game that's called Card Hunter, which is a pretty successful PC game, launched it in 2013, got some pretty good critical acclaim, and what we're doing right now is taking that game from PC over to mobile. We're bringing it over to tablets only. DropForge, the studio that I'm part of, has a handful of folks who were ex-PopCap and a handful of folks who were ex-Z2. I personally came from PopCap working on Bejeweled Blitz, among other products, and so what we tried to do is take some of those learnings in building mobile free-to-play titles and take that and approach it with Card Hunter as well. So for those of you who don't know what Card Hunter is, it's a really interesting game. It's part role-playing game, so you're building up your own characters, you're building up different items, you're going through the game and getting stronger and stronger. It's part collectible card game, which makes it a very interesting and different experience. So every single item that you get has a card attached to it. So this is an example of the card sheet that you get. So if you have a weapon, you might actually have bludgeons and chops as part of that, which are different types of cards. If you have a pair of boots, you might have a dash versus a walk. And the last piece of it is it's a tactics game. So as you play those moves, they play out on an isometric 3D or isometric 2D board game. So a lot of these things are what made this game renowned as the PC Gamer's most original game of 2013. And so my goal with this was to take this game that was seen as innovative, seen as fun and unique, and build a great experience for mobile as well. So there are a handful of things that we could do here, and one of the first things that people always try and say is, hey, why don't you just take the game, slap it on a mobile device, and just ship it, right? And frankly, it would have saved us a lot of time. It would have saved us, we could have done it in a month or two, and I think we would have had a lot of really happy customers to see that there was a game out there, but then as soon as they started playing it, they would have said, okay, this is garbage, and I'm not having fun with this at all. So what I'm trying to share today is really sort of what we tried to do as we went back to the drawing board and some of the processes that we tried to build out, and hopefully it'll help you guys out as you're doing the same. So the first thing I want to talk about is showing players where to go. So this is one of the most important things that differentiates PC games from mobile games. A lot of PC games sort of build upon things like open world experiences. Card Hunter is a good example of that. We actually, on PC, had this open world experience. You'd play, not quite open world, but you'd play different adventures, and as you won, you would unlock more and more cascading adventures. Yet one of the things that we found out was this was not actually as good as we thought it was going to be. So the idea was, okay, players will have more choices. Players will have more control of their destiny. It means they'll be happier, right? Yet one of the things we saw was that in the tutorial phase, we saw great retention numbers. 98% of people, so this is 2% of people dropped off level to level in tutorials 2, 3, and 4. And these are 3-minute, 5-minute, 7-minute tutorials. So these are longer actions here. Yet by the time we got into the open world experience, that changed dramatically. Right? So we saw 17% drop-offs. We saw 20+% drop-offs, which is something that you can tie back to a number of different things like difficulty. But one of the things we really felt was impactful that we did was giving players all these different choices and not really telling them or guiding them where to go and what to do. So you'd have things where people would go away for 3 days or go away for 5 days and come back and not actually understand what they were supposed to be doing and where they were supposed to be going. So we've done a handful of things differently as we've taken this to our second world map. So a couple slides ago I showed you the first version. This is sort of the concept of what we're building out in the second version. And I want to call out a few different things that we do here. First off, it's a clear linear path. So obviously there's, there may be little offshoots. You may be able to play one level here or there differently, but you know that after level 6 you're going to level 7. After level 25 you're going to level 26. Additionally, we want to try to do things like calling out visual calls to action on the board. So things like, it might be tough to read, but on the right-hand side, there's something like you can get rare items if you beat an individual quest. You have, we can reward rare chests or rare things that can keep bringing you along the process, and as you're playing, give you rewards and incentivize you to keep going for another 2 minutes or another 20 minutes. And additionally, we want to try and build together a variety of different visual experiences. So this is something that a lot of games don't do very well. They make the game sort of feel samey. You get through 5 levels and then 50 levels later it sort of feels like you're playing the same game. We really wanted to bring through that variety of visual experiences to help with that. And as you guys probably know, this isn't new, right? We're not talking rocket science here. Games like Candyland, which was built in the 1950s as a board game, if you've ever played it, that had a linear path. Games like Mario had a mostly linear path, and they did great things like calling out nodes at the end of each individual area. And one of the things that we wanted to do was say, okay, well, let's take some of the things that players are familiar with and build that toward them, and that helps a lot. So as I said, trying to build that clear, mostly linear path, building a variety of different visual experiences, and really sort of giving players an anticipation of rewards and some sort of key player beats to keep them going. Let them want to play an extra 5 minutes or 10 minutes. The second big thing I want to talk through is that tablet players play differently. So actually, the guys from Farmville talked a little about this earlier. The lady who preceded me from SGN said this as well. There are tons of different ways that players play games, right? And if you're building from cross-platform, you have to be able to understand that. And the first thing, and this is something I think Hearthstone did an incredible job with, is nailing that control scheme. This is the thing that your players interact with more than anything else within your game, right? This is something that 100% of your players are going to be using at the very beginning of the game, and then 50 levels in or 100 levels in. So you got to be able to nail that and do it in a way that makes sense. Hearthstone had a lot of upside in that they were able to build this game from scratch and make it for both of these platforms. Yet if you're doing what we're doing, which is taking a PC game that was already built for a different platform and then porting it, you may have to make some different sacrifices. So here are the few things that we're doing within our game. So within the PC version, we have a bunch of different rich controls and interactions that we have. It's hard to tell if you haven't played the game, but there's things like hovering over a card will show you some range, show you what your card can do. Left-clicking will then allow you to play that card and then target a unit to use, and then right-clicking will allow you to get information on that card. Yet, I don't know if any of you guys have used a mobile device, but you don't have any hover, you don't have any right-click, and the left-click or the left-click ends up being sort of more like your tap interaction. So what we tried to do was say, okay, well, hover doesn't make sense at all. Got to get rid of it and figure out, okay, how do we make that work for mobile audiences, all right? And how do we make that work for our game? So what we did was we actually sort of merged it into allowing a player to tap and see both the range as well as target the unit to use. And this is one of the things that actually makes the game feel better on mobile than it does on PC. Additionally, we used long tap, which I highly recommend because most game developers at this point are using long tap to replace right click. We've gone through a ton of iteration as we've gone through this, but we've had people say, oh, why don't you do a double tap or some sort of swipe gesture or something different. But at this point, games like Hearthstone, games like Angry Birds Epic have really sort of taken advantage of the long tap in replacement of right click, and I recommend it for us because it makes a lot of sense. The other big thing that I want to talk about in terms of how players play differently is session length. And I think this is something that people will pound on and bring out, but I really wanted to put some numbers to this. So most people don't really understand the true disparity. When you talk about games like XCOM and League of Legends, these are games that people are playing for 2.5 hours at a time. So they're sitting down at their desk and they're saying, okay, well, I'm in, right? And even games more mid-core and hardcore games like Kingdoms of Camelot on tablet are talking about a 32-minute game session. I think it was 32 or 34 minutes. Kabam just released those numbers. Yet the tablet average is only about 24 minutes. The iPhone average is about 19 minutes. So you're talking about dramatic disparities. And if you're building a game, so full disclosure, DropForge makes a little bit more core games. So what that means is you can't make a game that says, okay, let's build something that we're going to have a 40-minute gameplay experience, or we're going to have even a 20-minute gameplay experience, or individual game session. So any way that you can take your games and say, okay, we have a 40-minute session, but we want to create a 5-minute minigame, or we want to create a 3-minute minigame. You can see that, actually a good example, PopCap, where I was previously, did this with Plants vs. Zombies 2 when they added things like Zen Garden. So that gives you a reason to come back and play for a couple minutes at a time, rather than saying, okay, well, I have to get into a level and play a concurrent 7 to 10-minute session. So just recapping that, making your controls easy to use and easy to remember, taking advantage of tactility. So the iPad and the iPhone are actually nice and different from the PC. Take advantage of the features that make them unique. Encourage those short and rewarding sessions, and then also make games both easy to pick up and put down. So you want to allow a player to say, okay, I want to make 5 moves now, and then come back 3 days later and make the next 10 moves. Any way that you can encourage that will help you. So the next piece is something that both PC game makers and mobile game makers can really sort of take advantage of, and this is improving that first-time user experience. So actually this is something that's from Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, which I thought was one of the best first-time user experiences ever, in that it just made fun of the entire process. But I want to talk about how a lot of PC game makers do make those first-time user experiences, and what they'll do is, League of Legends I think is pretty indicative, but what they'll do is create a much longer sort of experience, and then do things that mobile developers can't do. So you get into League of Legends and you got to create your account. Immediately they say, okay, I want a password, I want your email address, I want your date of birth, and all sorts of other information. Finally, you download the game, and then it's a 50 megabyte download, after which you follow up with a bunch of EULAs and user agreements, which you have to most likely ignore and then click OK on. And then you get hit with a 1 gigabyte download, which can take anywhere between an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. And then finally you get to the tutorial after logging in, and this is the point in which you haven't played this game at all yet, and you've already waited for an hour and a half or 2 hours. It's something that works a little bit better on PC games, because I think a lot of PC gamers go into it with a mentality of, okay, we're going to come in, play this for a little while, and I'm already sort of built in with a predisposed idea that I'm going to like this game and play this game. Yet on mobile clients, there are a number of different things that you can do differently to make this a better experience. So for instance, with account creation, most mobile games can do a great job of building in guest mode for users. So allowing players to play without giving any sort of credentials for the first 30 minutes or the first hour. Because you never want to put a barrier to entry, right? Free-to-play was built on the premise of you're not putting barriers to entry of cost before you start playing the game. So why put a barrier to entry of asking a player for their email address? Why put a barrier to entry of asking them to download a gigabyte file? The other thing you can do with the gigabyte file download is maybe instead of a 50 megabyte download to start, you do 100 megs or 200 megs, and then allow them to actually play a little of the game, right, before they commit to downloading the rest of that gigabyte. Allow them to actually start playing the tutorial. A couple PC games have done this really well. Games like PvZ Garden Warfare and games like Hitman have done that recently. But mobile, I think, is even more compelling and even more imperative. I've worked on a couple games where the very first thing you get popped in on the screen, you download 50 megs, and you're like, okay, I'm ready to play, and then suddenly get hit with downloading client, right, and get hit with another couple hundred megs of something to download. Let the player play first, and then decide whether they want to enjoy your game and keep playing. I think that first-time user experiences are a great sort of marriage between game design, UI, UX, and analytics. And there's a bunch of people who are probably giving a talk on first-time user experiences at this conference today and have given it in the past. So the one thing I'll really try and harp on here is analytics. So any time that you can use player analytics to really iterate on your player behavior and understand, okay, what are players struggling with and how can we make it better, you'll be in a great spot. Obviously, this is the graph that I showed earlier, but this is something that we wouldn't have had if we hadn't instrumented our game with some funnel analysis and behavioral analysis. One thing that you can take, though, from PC game development to mobile is the idea that there's plenty more to come. So this is something that a ton of PC game developers have done incredibly well, which is within the first 5 minutes, show the player what a beefed up character looks like. Show the player what something exciting and something great is going to happen, right? The worst thing that you can do is have a player sit through 30 minutes or an hour of tutorial play, or even 10 minutes of tutorial play, without understanding that the game's going to get better, it's going to get more fun, it's going to get more complex and interesting. If you have depth, see if you can show it early on. And that's even showing a video or something like that. For instance, we did this in Card Hunter, where in the first few levels that you're playing, you actually get set up against this really big challenge and this really big sort of beefy monster, and it helped us with our early user retention. So yeah, teaching in bite-sized, understandable chunks, expecting that players may or may not complete it within the first session. So again, we talk about 20-minute iPhone and tablet sessions. Understand they may not finish that first-time user experience. So if you can chunk it up or allow it so that a player can play a little bit to start and then continue to play later, it helps. Show players that there's more to come, and then constantly iterate based on your analytics. So every time almost every time at least, I've come in and said, hey, I know exactly what's going to make this experience better. I've then tested it and found out, okay, well, maybe I can do something better, or maybe I can improve this. So using analytics wherever you can. The last piece that I want to talk about is once you have that user through your first-time user experience, once they enjoy the game, once they're having fun, give them a reason to come back. There's nothing more sort of sad and depressing than finding a user base who loves your game, enjoys your game, yet didn't have a reason to come back and so therefore quit. And this is actually exactly what happened with Card Hunter on PC. We had great first-day retention. So over 60% of our players stayed for day one, which frankly is huge, right? I don't know if most of you guys work in the space, but anything above 40% is pretty good. 60% is pretty phenomenal. Yeah, by the time we got to day 14, we get down to about 10% day 14 retention. And by the time we get down to day 30, we had less than 5%. So what happened, right? I mean, we sort of looked at this and said, did people just not like it? Was it too difficult? Was it not fun enough? Almost universally, we found that it was people saying, hey, I love this game. Card Hunter's fun, but you just didn't give me a reason to come back. Or I put it down and I never picked it back up again. Or I just forgot about it. This is sort of one of the worst things that you can do, and kind of a cardinal error that we made in building it, in that we got players to enjoy it, we got players to get through it, but then by the time we wanted them to keep playing, they just forgot about it and we didn't give them a reason. This is something we can take from a lot of great mobile games. Again, I worked on Bejeweled Blitz for a while, so we implemented Daily Spin, and that's something that created huge rewards for us in terms of getting players to stay retained. These are not new things, right? But Daily Spin, Hearthstone does a great job with their quest mechanic and saying, hey, come back tomorrow because there's a new quest. But those kind of always feel slapped on, and so any way that you can get greater integration helps as well. So, for instance, events. Events are a reason to say, okay, come 2 days from now, or come this weekend and play, as opposed to come 2 weekends from now, or as opposed to coming tomorrow. And additionally, any way that you can do built-in mechanics, those are really sort of your best option. And as I said, you saw the Farmville guys here earlier, if you were here, and they did a lot of, their whole game is based on built-in retention mechanics. Clash of Clans is entirely based on built-in retention mechanics. So if you can build it in, it's great. And then even though Liam Neeson doesn't like P2P mechanics, this is something that you can do using ways for asking friends, and it's the most impactful. There's plenty of talks on that, but it is impactful to have your friend asking you to come back and play as opposed to the game. And the last thing that I think a lot of developers don't really focus on but really matters is when you ask. So a lot of people try and say, okay, well, I'll boot up the game, and then that's the first time we're going to ask them for push notifications. I think that's actually one of the worst times that you can ask them for push notifications, because you get to the point where they say, again, it's like asking them to create an account, right? I don't know if I like your game. I don't know if I want to invest in your game. Why should I be accepting push notifications? So try and bring that in a little bit later. Try and bring that in at the point where the player's already invested and says, hey, I like this game. I want to know more. So just going back to that, the worst thing you can do is letting your players forget about your game. Use those rewards. Anytime you can use rewards to incentivize them back, it's essentially free to you because you'd rather have players that feel rewarded for coming back than have players who don't come back at all. And then pick the right time to ask for push notification permissions. So just to recap, thank you very much for coming, everyone. The big things I really wanted to touch on are showing a player where to go, building your controls for touch, so using gesture interaction since this is the thing they interact with the most. Reducing session lengths, improving the first-time user experience, since 100% of your players are going to experience that, and then give them a reason to come back at the end. Thank you very much. Again, I'm Jaremy Rich, and as I mentioned earlier, we are hiring at DropForge Games, so if you have any other questions, I think we might have some time for Q&A, but if you want to talk to me afterwards as well, I'm happy to field any questions. Thank you. Anyone? Don't be shy.
I'm curious about you know, how you apply your framework to adapting console games for mobile.
So I think there's a lot of really interesting things in terms of touch gestures to begin with. So I've seen a lot of game developers sort of say, okay, let's just slap on 2 joysticks because you use 2 joysticks. I think it can be tough, right? I think sometimes those games don't necessarily translate very well. For instance, talking about Bejeweled Blitz, we had a lot of trouble getting it from a touch interface or from a PC point and click to a PC experience, or sorry, to a console experience, because it doesn't feel as good with a joystick. But anytime you can iterate and start working with, we did a lot of usability testing. We did a lot of checking to see, okay, does this feel right? So in terms of controls, any way that you can constantly keep iterating and trying to make it the right experience helps. So I think touch controls is probably your biggest thing. I think the retention mechanics are something that are a no-brainer for anybody. I think any way that you can say, hey, give me some reason to come back, I think dramatically helps your retention, and then gives players a reason, as opposed to saying, hey, when you think about this, come play our game. So those are 2 of the biggest things I'd say to focus on.